Today, what I want to focus on and begin focusing on, because I'm not going to finish, is who may come to the table, to the Lord's table. And, that question, of course, you can look at it from a few different angles. We, as our bulletin states, with the visitors, who may, that's really answering the question, who may come. And it's answering the question actually from a very URC perspective, that it is those who have been baptized into the name of the triune God and who acknowledge their sins and are trusting in Christ for forgiveness and cleansing and who desire to live a godly life, but then also who are professing members in good standing of a Bible-believing, and we would say also Protestant church. And we say that Protestant in there because the Catholic approach to communion is very different, and even our confessions say it's a condemnable idolatry. It speaks very strongly that, this is actually Christ who's being offered again. And so that the bread and wine become Christ is making it an idol, making the bread and wine an idol. And we're actually going to get into some of that itself. But really where I'm going to be focusing on is not so much those questions, just because we deal with that all the time and we talk about that all the time. But the question of pedo communion is what I want to be talking about. And obviously, and pedo communion means child communion, okay? We believe in pedo baptism, and the argument is, well, if you believe pedo baptism, why don't you allow just young children and infants to come to the Lord's table? And so that's really what I want to be focusing on. And there's been a number of guys who have written on it. One of them is Dr. Cornell Venema. Dr. Venema is the president of Mid-America Reformed Seminary. Very close ties to the URC. He himself is an ordained pastor in the URC. And he's written on this in a few different places. But he says this, and I think this is correct. This is why I'm quoting. The exact question to be addressed is this: does membership in the covenant, which is signified and sealed to children of believing parents in their baptism, constitute a sufficient basis for admitting them to the table of the Lord? So just bringing it all the way down, that's the question. Does their being admitted, in the covenant, and that's been signified, signed, and sealed in their baptism, is that sufficient grounds, a sufficient basis for admitting them to the Lord's table? And the thing is, some people say yes, and others say no. And this has been an issue that has, it's a real issue that is in confessional Reformed churches. We're not just talking about, sort of liberal thing. That's not what we're saying here. But it's an issue that, the OPC has dealt with, the URC has dealt with, and other churches. PCA, I think, actually, there are PCAs that definitely allow for pedo communion. I don't know if the OPC, do some churches practice it? Oh, that many. Okay, young child. So, okay. Yeah, okay. So certainly some churches in the OPC do. Let me ask this: would they require a certain profession from those younger children? Yes. Okay. Okay, yeah. So that would be, I think, maybe a softer position than some. But anyway, one of the OPC pastors, Leonard Kappas, has written a book on it. It says, "Daddy, May I Take Communion?" was the name of the book. And interestingly, a PCA guy that you probably know, Peter Lightheart, he responded Daddy, to Coppis's book, and he responded, Daddy, why was I excommunicated? So, so it's, okay, there's some internal things going on here, some little battles going on. A book that I really like, and I'm using pretty heavily in my material here, is each chapter is written by a different author, but it's edited by Guy Waters and Ligon Duncan. And these guys are PCA guys. And the book is called Children and the Lord's Supper. And that actually has OPC guys have written in that, URC guys have written in it, PCA guys. And it falls on that a position against paedo communion is where that book is. And but they're, it came to the URC in, I want to say, 2004, at our synod in Calgary, Alberta in 2004. So 20 years ago, it came because a graduate of Mid-America Seminary held to a paedo communion position, and was not received to be a pastor in the URC. So the URC made a kind of a decision there, and kept him from being a pastor in the URC. So it's and this same person, his name is Tim Gallant. He's written a book called "Feed My Lambs" in favor. "Feed My Lambs." Is a book that he wrote in favor of paedo communion. There's another book in favor by a CREC pastor, Greg Strawbridge. "The Case for Covenant Communion" was the name of that book. So it's out there, is what I'm saying. It's a conversation that is out there, and yeah, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law. On Debbie's side, they go to a PCA church that practices paedo communion. So it's there. The PCUSA allows for it. The RCA allows for it. And the CRC has officially allowed paedo communion, I think, since 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Something right around there. So anyway, it's out there. So I do want to talk about that. But it's such an interesting, I'm finding it very interesting, looking at it historically. I mean, because there are some people who argue that is the historical position since the early church. I'm not convinced of it. It's funny how you can have an early church father write and two different people look at the same thing that he wrote, and one say, "Oh, this is what he means," and the other says, "No, this is what he means." And so, "Oh, okay, well, so you get that going on, and the thing is, it's not like directly discussed in early church writings, and so you have to make some sort of inferences and deductions, and that's where it's difficult. Justin Martyr in Rome. He was in Rome, Italy, and he said this, quote, "This food is called among us the Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake but the man who believes that the things we teach are true and who has been washed with the washing of regeneration for the remission of sins, and the one who is so living as Christ has enjoined." Now, clearly, that would be a position that we would say, yeah, that's a good position. The person needs to understand and believe and be regenerate and then be living a life that's in accord with God's word. But the question, what others would say is, but he's not really talking about children in the covenant. He's talking about adults. So, Origen is in Alexandria, Egypt. And he made the point that the Eucharist was like eating meat, and the young were still only able to drink milk. And so he seemed to have a bit more clear position early on. But Cyprian, who is in 250 AD in Carthage, North Africa, his writings seem to be in favor of pedo communion. And it's pretty clear by the 5th century that children coming to the Lord's table was the standard practice. That seemed to be the case. So this is very interesting, isn't it? That, okay, that this is actually was really an issue. But it was based. The reason that it became the standard practice was because the church, viewed like a baptized child as regenerate because the child was baptized. In other words, it's the ex opere operate, if you're familiar with that term, of the work it is done, or of the thing done, it is done. In other words, by baptism, that act of baptism itself regenerates the child. If the work itself does it, that's the point. That's what ex opere operate of the work it is done, and that was kind of the going position of the church at that point, and so therefore the sacrament accomplishes what is signified. Okay, and since that was the mindset, then the Lord's Supper. And our children should be fed. Our children should be nourished. And therefore, since it itself accomplishes what it signifies, then our children, because that is so, then our children should come to the table. This is why, by the way, why we use phrases such as faith is the hand and mouth of the soul. That's taken from the Belgic Confession. But we make a point that no. The Lord's Supper, if we take it, if we receive it without faith, that's only adding condemnation to ourselves. It's not accomplishing our nourishment, right? Do you follow what I'm saying? That faith needs to be involved in that. And so, but anyway, according to the early church in the 5th century and onward, they allowed children and even infants to the table. And St. Augustine of Hippo, whom we know well and appreciate, he says, quote, "They are infants, but they receive his sacraments. They are infants, but they share in his table in order to have life in themselves." And so he was, also a product of his time and such. So then you have what we would call the medieval church from the 5th century to the Reformation, pretty much, that whole time, 1,000 years or so. And what the church at that point, their practice was this, that if a child was born to members of the church, the practice was to baptize the infant and then to have what they call a confirmation, where the priest would lay hands on the infant. So first baptism, and then confirmation, and then the Eucharist. And they would give the infant the Eucharist. And this would happen all in the same service. It had to happen in that order, though. Okay, so that was very important. So that there's the baptism happens, and then there's a confirmation, a laying on of hands, because the idea was that the laying on, that confirmation was necessary before that infant was to receive the sacrament, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. And you might actually ask, well, wait a minute, how does an infant take bread, right? And how does that all work? Well, there's a name for that. It's called intinction. I don't know if you've heard that. Intinction. I-N-T, let me find it here, I-N-T-I-N-C-T-I-O-N. Intinction. And what that was that the priest would dip a little piece of bread into the wine and make it all soggy, and then just kind of put it in the mouth, and it would just kind of melt, and and the child would thereby take communion. That's how it was done, and that was called intinction. And so they had a word for it even, and that's how that infant would happen. But then what happened? Over time, it was decided that only bishops can confirm. Okay, so you remember you have infant baptism, and then the confirmation, and then the Eucharist. But it was decided that only bishops could do the confirmation. Well, there's not a bishop at every church. And so the local priest could baptize, but he was not able to do the confirmation. And sometimes it would take years before a bishop would come to a particular church and actually do a confirmation, at which point the child then could partake of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. And so what that did is now it put time between between baptism and the Lord's Supper. And the families kind of found that to be a good time to instruct the children of things. And so by a very weird way, there was that sense that, okay, the children need to be instructed before partaking of communion. So it just really happened in a very strange way, at least strange in my mind. And it was seen as a good thing, that our children were instructed prior to partaking of the Eucharist. What really, though, sealed things, interestingly, was the Fourth Lateran Council. That was in 1215 A.D., the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, we're talking here Roman Catholicism, right? That's what we're talking within that, the Western Church in Roman Catholicism. They declared that the Fourth Lateran Council declared and made as Roman Catholic dogma that transubstantiation was the Roman Catholic position on the Lord's Supper. So interestingly, before then, a lot of them believed in transubstantiation, but the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 actually put it down and saying this is the Roman Catholic teaching. And transubstantiation, you remember, we talked about that last time, was that the bread and the wine actually in their substance turn into the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Okay? That's transubstantiation. Well, that resulted in some interesting things. One thing it did is it resulted in fewer people coming to the table. And the reason is they were afraid. They were fearful of coming to the table, because if you dropped your bread or you spilled your wine, you're dropping Christ. Right? It's like, oh, this is, and people were afraid. And so there were less and less people coming to the Lord's table. And after a while, what happened was, because of that only the priest would give the bread to the people, but only the priest would be taking the wine, not even the people, because of fear of spilling. So, there's all kinds of things, of course, we could say about that. But since that's the case, and now the laity, the people were not getting the wine, neither then could they practice intinction. Follow that? Because then the infants shouldn't be if the parents don't get the wine, why would we give it to the infants, right? And so then intinction wasn't happening, and so the infants were not receiving the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. So just some very interesting things going on. And but what that resulted in is a greater emphasis on a confession, of some kind of a confession, before coming to the table. So again, just kind of a strange way that got the church there to that point. Well, let me quickly, then you have the Reformation in 1517, beginning in 1517 with Martin Luther, of course. And but in the years following, in Protestant churches, it was near unanimity against paedo communion. at the Reformation. And nobody questions that. Even people in favor, even Reformed people in favor of paedo communion recognize that the reformers did not believe that we should have paedo communion. So there's no, I say near unanimity. There was one guy, I didn't even put his name down here, but he was in favor of it, but he was a wacko. But they typically believed that one needed to be able to examine themselves and to be able to discern the body, and that's something that infants and young children really are not able to do. And that really comes down to the heart of it. In other words, it requires a certain age of discretion and some profession of faith. And they understood that the sacrament is received by faith. It's not ex opere operato. It's not ex opere operato. It is received by faith. And that's and that is how we are nourished. Calvin, held to this position. However, he did believe that children should be able to profess their faith around 10 to 12 years old, in that range. Okay? So where, some of us, I grew up in the CRC. It was pretty standard where you were 17 or 18, 16 maybe, but 17 or 18 before you would do profession of faith. That's how it was when I was growing up. I never liked it. It was like you've gone through all the catechism classes, and this is kind of graduation. And okay, now you're ready to profess faith. I've always thought that's a wrong approach to what profession of faith really is. But anyway, that's how it was in when I was growing up. Calvin said, 10 to 12. In fact, he said if by 13 or 14 the child hasn't professed their faith, maybe they need to be put under discipline. So that's where Calvin was. So that's okay. Yeah. So at least consider it. So anyway, I'm just saying that is his position. I'm not saying that that's our position or anything else. I'm just saying that's where Calvin was at, just to let you know what was going on in the minds of the reformers. But what's interesting, just going through that history up to that point, there were hundreds of years when paedo communion was the majority position in our church history. Okay, hundreds of years from about the 5th to the 15th century, about 1,000 years, where paedo communion was actually the majority position. And then, but again, like in all things, we do well to say, well, why? Why was it? And as you look at that history, you say, oh, that's very interesting. That they were believing these things and holding to these things. And the reformers followed the practice of the later medieval church, where the church wasn't giving it to them, but for different reasons. Not for the same reasons, but for very different reasons. And so we're going to be looking at that more as we look at what the confessions say, and then what our church order says, and then just looking at what the URC has decided. So I have to stop there because our time has run out. Any questions or comments?